Director of Marketing and Development here at the Kitsap History Museum. So welcome everybody who hasn't been here before. Glad to have you. We've got a couple of events coming up. We've got our gala coming up, and we're selling tickets for that now online or at the front desk. And it's a 1960s theme, so it should be really fun. It's at the Kitsap Golf and Country Club, so please come and join us for that. We're also going to be at the fair, August 20th through 25th. And we've got our pole barn building out there, and if you guys haven't been, we've got all kinds of rural history that is amazing stuff to come behold. And Bill is one of our long-term volunteers who knows everything about every piece of equipment that you do, everything out there you know about, and it's fascinating. So I highly recommend coming and seeing this at the fair. We do try and keep these events free, open to the public, so please think about donating. And another way to support us is become a member of the museum, and that is another great way. Our patron membership has a NARM membership as part of it, which gets you into reciprocal museums all across the United States. So it is really, really worthwhile. I think that our speaker tonight needs no introduction. I think everybody knows David Nelson, and he's here to tell us about 90 years of the Kitsap Sun. Well, most of you guys probably remember it as the Bremerton Sun, but now known as the Kitsap Sun. And so without further ado, David Nelson.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. Does that sound okay? I'm right in front of that speaker.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you all for coming. And thanks to Paul next door, who's the sponsor of this. Right?
Oh, I forgot. Yes,
Bremerton
Paul,
Typewriter
yes.
is the
Bremerton
sponsor of
Typewriters.
this stuff.
Yes.
In our history, we've used a few of those, so we need to say thank you to them.
Yes.
I hope everyone, I assume if you're here, you got a chance to read some of the coverage from last week about the Kitsap Sun's anniversary, and it's 90 years. And so there's already some of that news is out. I'll probably repeat a few things, but I hope you all get the background from those stories and the timeline of things, because what I want to do tonight is we'll go through some of that timeline, but I want to let you go home with some fun stuff, some stories. This is a history talk, but I'll talk about the present a little bit as well, and kind of mix some of those things in there. So the institution is 90 years old, and the institution is what's so important. And not just us, but I think all institutions are important. That's a big kind of core belief of mine. They deserve to be held accountable, so do we. But that's what we also do. That's why we're here. That's why it's important. There's a problem in society right now of kind of some breakdown. I think everyone would see that in maybe different ways, but I think what we do is part of the antidote to that, and has been for a long time, and I think kind of still will be for a long time. One of the things I wrote in my column is it's not as robust as I'd like it to be right now. People who've worked at the Sun before, they know what it was at one time. Yeah. We know what it's capable of, but it's still important. Every little bit still has value, and I will show some of that stuff as we go going here. But I'm gonna talk, the institution is what we're celebrating. That's the name that gets 90 years, and no one person has been here for all of it. But what we're gonna talk about is tell the story through people, because I think that's a better way. Come on in.
Come on in.
There's a young newspaper reader. We're recruiting tomorrow. If you've worked at the Sun, would you raise your hand or stand if you could? Because I know there's a group of you. There's many. One of my favorite things is when people say they've worked there, and the number of people who come through that door really does reach all over the community. A couple weeks ago, the back door at the loading dock, we have a bad loading dock. Michael knows this because he works there too, in the building. And the latch, it leans. The building is sinking, and so the latch leans, and sometimes it won't lean. So every couple of weeks, I gotta call this guy to come tighten the latch up so that no one sneaks in the back in the dead of night. And what did he do? he used to be a paper carrier. And it warms my heart every time I meet someone who says, well, I used to do that. They like to criticize the current paper carriers is the only problem. They know how to do it best. Okay, so we're talking about people the right way. So it's a history talk, but we're gonna start in the present, because this is our news theme right now. Some of them are here and they're getting embarrassed back there, but you don't need to be. It's a small crew. Megan Reed is the photographer. She's taking the photo of this group. And it is, but I'm so proud of this group of people. And so I wanted to make sure you saw who they are, you saw who shows up all the time. We cover as many things from Olalla all the way to Hansville that we can. What we do is scramble. It's really hard what we do. I hope everyone understands that. And I'm not here to complain or make excuses, but it's hard. And we work fast and we go and go. We just hit the gas every morning and get as far as we can. It's working is something I do want to tell you. This gentleman right here was just asking me, because he has a vested interest in the Sun with your family connections, but he said, where are you guys right now? And I'll offer that. We're part of a big company, and I'll get to how that all came about in a little bit. This is a paper that we're still lucky to have. There's a lot of places that don't, and I think that's very, very important to know. There's communities in Washington that don't. There's a paper that gets printed 6 days a week. It gets delivered to doorsteps, which is incredibly rare in this day and age. And so we should be proud we still have those things. We get 25,000 people to come to our website each day. We get a significant portion of those paid for a subscription. The finances make sense for what they are right now. And so I say that, I'm not gonna get into every detail about it, but that's important for you to know. It is sustainable at the level we're at right now. We wanna grow it. There's things I'll talk about on how we do that. But I think that's my encouraging note to you to start with. We're lucky that we have Jeff Graham is right next to me there. Jeff's been at the Sun about 20 years. Connor Wilson is to his left over there. Connor is a WSU Murrow Fellow. This is a unique thing that we're involved with right now. We got selected. The state legislator allocated some money to Washington State University, and so we could bring on journalists as they're called fellows. And so Connor's here with us for 2 years covering healthcare, which the state picks up the tab for it, and at the end of it, we hope that we can convince Connor to maybe stay. He's done a wonderful job. Pei Lin is back here. Pei is a wonderful story. She grew up in Taiwan, actually worked internationally on newspapers in journalism, and then came to the United States, got a master's degree, worked for the Arizona Republic, and then came up here and has been with us for a few years. So we're so glad to have her, and she covers the military. The 2 young women on the side, in the middle on the left, are Jessica and Skylar. Those are both summer interns who've been with us this summer, who've done a wonderful job. That beefs up the coverage. I'll talk later about how we do that, but always, we not only do it for readers because I want more stories and we want to cover this stuff, but we do it, it's very important to me to see the next generation of what we're doing. If we don't give young people an opportunity, this will dry up. I won't have anyone to hire, and that's a real other threat right now, is finding people who want to come into this, into a career that's tough. And then Marissa Conter, she's also been with us for about a year. Marissa Conter, she covers public safety. And so I just wanted you to see who we are as we get started. These aren't people stories. I'll get to the people stories. I'm still going to preach for a second. This is why it matters. Still matters, even at the, we're not covering every single story, but we cover stuff that has impact. That's what I always tell people. I want stories that have impact. Over here on the left, these are just a couple that actually did lead to something. Lauren Evans, everyone knows this story, the North Kitsap School Superintendent. We got a call one morning. I literally got a call on my cell phone of someone who said, guess what just happened? Because they had seen this incident. They were at the Rotary meeting and they saw something going on and thought to call us. That is the best thing you can do to support us. Now give us your money as well. But the best thing to do is if you see things going on, let us know. That currency is worth so much. So someone told us, and we were on this story before anyone else, and we followed it all the way through until Lauren's departure from the school district. She was stealing signs associated with a bond. It was an absolute ethical breach. Should not have been doing that. We have to hold these people accountable. The one on the other side, again, no one was talking about this. It's Judge Tracy Flood, the Bremerton Municipal Court. we started hearing rumors about people departing. And so I read through a stack of letters to Human Resource Department to figure out what was going on and to piece together how many people. When the first story came out, I think it was this 13th employee who had left in the course of a year. That has all led to the judge is currently suspended, and we're working on a story about the new interim judge who's running the court. So again, it's holding, that's impact, it's holding an institution accountable. And there's an election this fall for a judge, and I think if you live in Bremerton, you're gonna pay more attention than maybe you did the last time around. I wanna know who's gonna run that place, who's gonna rebuild it. The one in the middle is kind of silly. Well, not silly, it's important. But it came from this it was not styled as investigative journals or anything like that. There's a woman named Mary Lou Sinelli who lives on Bainbridge Island who writes wonderful columns for us. I hope you read them. There's one in this Sunday's paper. She's a writer, she's an author, she writes books, and so she was on a walk and she saw this rookery and she found out it's for sale, and it's where herons live. And it was on Bainbridge Island, and indeed, it was gonna go up for sale, nothing was going on. She wrote a column about it. It was in December, was it December 24? I think it was last December.
2024.
It was just last December. By February, the Bainbridge Island Land Trust had launched a campaign to raise money. This property has been bought and preserved. So that something happened because we were there and wrote a column about what she liked. And so I just say that to say there, we're not covering every single story, but we want to cover ones that have impact and do something. There's also an aspect of our job, not every story does that. This is not where I think that's a stereotype sometimes, that every journalist, change comes from everything you write. It doesn't. But it also tells us who we are. And so we do try to mix in stories. Maybe it's not impacting the same way, but it tells who we are. And the reason I put the Cleveland family up here, Shane Cleveland is right here, and his wife Karen. These are their daughters. This story was in the paper a couple weeks ago, and I'll tell you why I'm using it as an example. In January, February, there's an Instagram post by a guy named Nate Robinson. Nate Robinson is an NBA player. He played at the University of Washington, sports star. And he put up an Instagram about how his life was just saved by that guy, Shane Cleveland. As I just encouraged you, someone called me and said, Shane Cleveland lives in Bremerton. And so I tried to get in touch with Shane. He said, no, I'm recovering. He certainly strongly indicated that Nate Robinson's in charge of this story, not me. And he's not gonna talk to you. And sure enough, he didn't, because he wanted to talk to ESPN and basketball writers, and he was launching a shoe line, all this other stuff. So we said, that sucks, because as a local reporter, you want the local story, but what can you do? Well, last month I thought I should call Shane Cleveland again. We called him and he said, oh yeah, I'd love to talk. And so we told the story, but we included Kara, and we included their kids, and we included all that. And I thought, boy, I wanted to do it. I'm stubborn, I didn't want to get turned down. I guess that's part of it. But I had a fear. Everyone's already heard this already. That story got 11,000 views over the weekend, which is a very strong number for us. And it reminded me, local people still want to know the local story. It wasn't good enough for you just to know Shane Cleveland did this for Nate Robinson if you'd heard about that. You wanted to know who he was, you wanted to know who his family was, you wanted to know what drove them to donate their kidneys. His wife had donated a kidney as well. So I use that example only because there's a lot of stories that remind us who we are. I think that's really important. It goes back to the institutions, it goes back to the civic, being part of a community. You want to know who you are and see your neighbors in the paper. And so we still do that too, that's important. And then, this is my last one, and then I'll get into the history. These are both photos by Megan Reed. I hope everyone knows Megan M. Reed's name. You don't know her face because she's always on the other side of the camera. She doesn't want the notoriety. We put them there every day. When I did the package on the 90th anniversary, there's a story in there about Cliff McNair. Cliff McNair was a photographer of the Sun in the 70s, and he and his son were killed in 1982 when they slipped on the ice and were hit by a truck going the other way near Port Angeles. After Cliff's death, it was on the front page the next day. He was beloved in the community. He did what Megan does. He would go out and just take pictures of what's going on. Everything she doesn't do isn't a sign. She spends her morning cruising around. She calls it cruising. I say, what are you doing today? I'm gonna cruise for a while. And we call them standalones. And so often the front page is a standalone. It's just an image that shows you something. We have heard multiple times of people who clip them and put them on their walls or put them on their refrigerators. It's heartwarming. And so what struck me so strongly is this letter to the editor. Marge Keaveney writes a letter to the editor 2 days after Cliff's death, talking about what it means to see one of his images each day and how important that was to her. That's in 1983. In 2025, 42 years later, that's a letter we ran the other day. It's almost the exact same thing. Richard Schaefer thanking her for taking him. He's, I don't know the proper word to say. Richard doesn't get around very much, let's say that. He's older and struggles to get around. She takes him to places, and I think that's such a compliment. And that it was going on back then, it's still going on today, and I think that's important to note also. Okay, now what you came for is the history talk in a history museum. That's the first edition of the Sun right there, and I happen to have a copy. This is a framed edition. The whole thing is inside here. And not only do I have this copy, this is one that sat in the sun for a long time. Actually, it was buried in a basement. No one would know. When we cleaned out, we found it. But also, I have another copy. And Julius Gaius was the first editor. And so this is his column right here. He introduced the paper to the community. And about 10 years ago, I got a manila envelope in the mail. And I opened it. It was from California, and I opened it. And it was one of these with red pen marks all over it. It was Julius's copy from the second day that he had corrected to show everyone the mistakes we'd made. They had one reporter at the time, Jack Rogers was the only one. And his son had found it. His son's in his 80s now. And he had found it and thought to send it out to him. So that's a prized possession of mine, but this one I'll show to you. But the backstory here, because I told you get some backstories for showing up tonight. You know, there's Puyallup and these other things. I've always laughed that the very first had a Bill Mahan, who was on the front page. It was not the same Bill Mahan.
Yeah.
But on the back page of this edition is a little article by Julius Gaius. And it says, "Hot news goes up in smoke," is the headline on it. So they're sitting there, and he introduces the column saying how frustrated he's been because they came over on Memorial Day. He and Ralph Erickson come over from Seattle on Memorial Day to start this paper. It was where Beyond Karaoke is down on 4th Street. That was the original spot. And a fire happened. The Navy's hiring. There was one other like high profile. Someone got killed. I don't know, beat up. And so he writes this thing how it's driving him nuts because if you do our job, when you know something, you want to share it. You don't want to sit on it. And so he says, "I want my paper." So they're sitting there the morning before this, and someone calls and says there's a shooting in the alley between 4th and Burwell. That's around the corner from my new office. I got a paper coming out tomorrow. So he runs around the corner to cover the shooting. And it's a bunch of guys shooting dice, and they all start. And he writes in there, he can tell this is going to become a theme, and he's right. I mean, it still happens today. But I thought that's how we got to start. So you can have a sense of humor right from the get-go. So they start July 15th, 1935 at 534th Street. The reason it's there is because there's a newspaper in Seattle. There's a newspaper in Seattle called The Star, and it's run by a couple of cousins with the last name Scripps. Scripps is a big newspaper name across the country. And so these cousins decide we need to start a paper in Bremerton. And so they hire a 23-year-old and a 27-year-old guy and say, "You're going to go over there to 4th Street, and you're going to start this newspaper." So they come over on Memorial Day. They have 6 weeks to get everything up and running. Got their spot. They hire a reporter, put a paper together, and put it out. They're right across the street from what was called the Daily News Searchlight. It's also on 4th Street. So it was very intentional. We are going to go to a newspaper war against this company. So they do that for 5 years. They're producing a paper, but it's hard to go against the big dogs. And a lot of the advertisers don't want to start with the new one. We're happy with the Jessup family runs the News Searchlight, and everyone's happy with that. We don't need a new one. Theaters refuse to advertise with the new. Well, after 5 years, it's losing a lot of money. Every month it's in the red, $9,000, $9,000, these things like that. It's dying. And so you could say, why are we here today? The Scripps brothers, the Scripps guys in Seattle, have a cousin in California named John P. Scripps. And they owe John money. And so they decide, we don't have the money to pay John, and they call him and say, how would you like to own how about we give you this? They're doing this while they're trying to, their landlord at that spot is Ed Bremer. And he says, well, he's trying to move them down the block to a different shop. They could be a little bigger or something like that. And the guys in Seattle are like, ugh, are you kidding? We're not getting you any money, right? We're not throwing good money after bad with how you've been performing over there. They call John on the phone. He wires $5,000 up. He says, move to the next place. There's a story about how they literally started picking their furniture up when they found out and running it down the block to get going and get the paper out the next day. And then John takes over the paper, saves it. It becomes part of a chain that he owns and stretches down through California. JPNS is what it's called. 5 years later, in 1945, the Jessup family is offering their paper for sale to the Sun. They were ready to pull. Hands up, they give up. We give up, you guys win the newspaper war. And so John buys that paper, it all becomes the Sun, and technically the Daily News Searchlight is part of our company, if you want to say it that way. So that's the guy who saves this newspaper in this town. The other one had been around for 40 years. There were a litany of other newspapers in Kitsap County kind of in that couple of decades previously. Tracy didn't see back. Everywhere has a little paper, and then it becomes the big guy. In 1945, when this all comes together, they move over to the site on 5th Street, 545, where we are still today. One side of the building was a doctor's clinic, the salmon clinic, I think it was, and then we were right next door. And then throughout the decades have expanded since, and we still sit there today in our newsroom, which I'll get to in just a second. More people stories. You can't tell the story of the Sun without talking about Adele first. And I imagine a lot of people here would remember her or remember that name. I told a story in the recent edition about the bridge that was named after her. There's plenty of things out there about how she was this intimidating political reporter, but also really important in terms of women in journalism. And that's why it's really important to remember her for that. That Adele started, and if you go look back, it's just almost comical to see they really called it the woman's page. That was where the recipes were, and that's where you stayed. And it was Adele who wouldn't take that. And so she originally writes this column called The Farmer's Daughter, but breaks into wanting to be a political reporter, and does. It becomes probably the most powerful one in the state for a time being. In the story that I wrote, I mentioned how Ralph Monroe from Bainbridge Island had a quote that said, actually, I think, I might have stole this one from Steve Gardner when you wrote Adele's obituary. But that Ralph said when in Olympia, they would all gather around the newsstand, and everyone from this side of the water wanted to get that paper to make sure Adele wasn't talking about them. She was well known, and other stories I've heard of, you didn't go into her office, she called you into her office, things like that. And eventually left the Sun because when you have that personality, you don't like editors, and editors maybe don't like you. So there are stories about that too, that you didn't change any of the words she wrote, and if you did, you heard about it. We worked with John Hughes at the Washington State Secretary of State's office to do a book about Adele. So this is part of the Washington State Legacy or Heritage Project, I think it's called. And this is your funny little nugget from this. In the beginning of the book, Adele, she dedicates the book. She played a role in this. She was still alive at the time. She dedicates the book to her English teacher, Mrs. Cunningham, and the best editor she ever learned from, Julius Guyes. Makes sense. He hired her, he brought her up, and gave her that opportunity. John Hughes dedicates it to the Caruthersville Democrat and the Caruthersville Republican for believing in Adele. Has anyone ever read the Caruthersville Republican or the Caruthersville Democrat? Never come across that? No one's read those publications? because they don't exist, she made it up to get her job. She faked her own resume. And so the crusading reporter who was after the truth got in the backfield. The other person there. The other person is Andrea Grasso. And if you live in Port Orchard or South Kitsap, you know that last name. That's a very prominent family name. South Kitsap Stadium was built by, I believe it's her uncle or grandfather. I'm gonna misstate that. In any case, 2 years ago I met her. And that was a trip that I took down to her home in Port Orchard. It was her father's home that she had just moved back into from Seattle. Her father's name was Jerry. And if you read that package on the 90th anniversary, I talked about Jerry, wrote Jerry's story. Jerry grew up in South Kitsap, went to Washington State, and then starts working in the Sun sports department. He becomes a political writer, military writer. He covered the military, and he was a photographer. He took a lot of pictures as well for about 15 years with the Sun. But his true passion was archaeology. And so during the 60s, when a lot of things were being discovered in Washington State, he goes over Marmas Man over near Pullman, and the Ozette village up on Washington coast were the big ones. And so he would spend his vacations going to these places, and then he'd come back and write stories about them. Well, he goes on and he becomes kind of famous and very noteworthy in that field. He returns to Kitsap. He died of a heart attack in 1988, but there's a totem pole in his honor down there. And that was the story I told him, just to say it real brief. But the reason Andrea called me was she said, she had just moved back. Her mother-in-law, Jerry's wife, her stepmother, excuse me. Her stepmother had left the home where she had lived all those years. Andrea had moved back and she says, you've got to see this. The home had been lived in, but nothing had been touched. Jan, his widow, had just lived around all of his stuff. And so, sure enough, his typewriter is still there. There's old binders full of Sun stuff. There's a style guide of the Sun at the time. There's old photo negatives. All of this stuff still exists. It's like a museum. And so it's just fascinating, and I look around, and there's a stack of black and white photos of Bremerton Sun parties in the 1950s. And really interesting stuff. And she makes a comment about how stuff turns up. She says, oh, my dad's still haunting this house. I know he is. And the door opens at a certain time, or something I've been looking for. Oh, there it is. Something like that. So she believes this. I wrote the story about Jerry. It was in this paper 2 Sundays ago. And on Thursday before this Sunday, the designers worked on this. We work with virtual designers, but I can kind of peek into the system and peek over their shoulder, see what they're doing, see if I like the design, if it's okay. And I'm glancing through the pages, and there's an obituary that day. No one else knows I'm writing this story. The staff doesn't even know I'm writing this story. No one knew I was writing about Jerry. I had told Andrea. Andrea knew she was writing about Jerry. His widow's obit is in that day's paper. She had just died in California. And I called Andrea and told her, she says, oh yeah, Jerry did that. She believes in the ghost. But that's fascinating. That's your other These are just 2 guys, and I put them up there because they're great old photos. They're people you may know because both of them still live in town, and they are emphasizing my point about how important the people are. That this newspaper has had a legacy of people who stay, and they stay for lengthy periods of time, and that's so important. That is the most important thing in journalism today, because you can't get a new person every couple months and expect them to know everything. People who stay. I can tick off names of people who worked for over 25 years. Some of them are here. Deborah, how 23 years did we decide? Deborah Wilson was there. I don't know how far.
Good years. 20.
Barb was 20. Anne?
20.
20, yeah. See, this is what I'm talking about. Ed Friedrich, Larry Stiegel, Chris Dunnigan, some of those names that you guys would remember. Right now, Jeff Graham, Megan Reed, I've been there about that length of time.
Chuck Stark.
And so it's so important. But the king...
Larry Stiegel.
What's that?
Chuck Stark.
Shout him out, Chuck Stark, yeah. There's a lot.
Steve Zuxworth.
Zuxworth,
Larry Steve
You know, this is important stuff that people still remember those names. But the king is Ron Mulligan. Because we're celebrating 90 years right now. Ron was there for half of them. Ron worked for us for 45 years with a little time away to be in the Air Force. But other than that, he started as a paper carrier. He at one point got to be the general manager, and the general manager at that, there's been different configurations of how leadership was set up, but general manager would have been the equivalent boss with the editor at one time over the business side, and Ron did that. The end of his career, he was managing the press room downstairs. So I put him up there as that example, and it's just a sharp looking picture from 1988. And then Jim Campbell's on the other side. I was lucky enough to work with Jim. He retired a few years ago as the opinion editor, but again, 30 years at the Kitsap Sun, long time tenure there, still lives in town. Jim is actually a very interesting side story about him. He did not instigate this law, but there is law on his behalf. The Sun newsroom is a union newsroom, and that happened in the 1970s. Correct me on any of this, because you know it better than I do, but a primary driving reason was the editor, Gene Gisley. We've had 7 editors in the history of the paper, 90 years. Julius Gaius was 25 years, Gene Gisley was also more than 20. So those are the 2 longest tenures right there. And he was known to fire people at the drop of a hat. Is that, would you say that's accurate? You don't know. My impression was that was why a union was important, was to protect jobs, because this is the time when people could do that. Jim, the interesting little note about Jim is he was the opinion editor, which would speak on behalf of the paper, and so there is state law that mentions that he could not be in the union because he's behaving on behalf of the paper. So just a fun little detail. They had to like litigate that out, what his job. And here's one more. I've got to tell this one. This is another really long time person, Terry Mosher. And Terry actually was a sports writer in Kitsap for more than 50 years, but not all of it was with us. So Ron gets the award, not Terry. Terry comes in the 70s. He died just in December, just this past December. Terry passed away. And he was writing up until the end. In fact, the interesting little note is he had sent me a story, and then in the last couple of years, he'd be kind of sporadic when I would get the stories. And so I ended up holding one to get the other one first, and it turned out we still had one left when he passed away. So one of the rare times where a story would be published posthumously was Terry Mosher. He still got one the next week to go out, and his family was happy to hear that. But as I kind of researched a story on Terry, and I feel bad, I never knew this. That plaque right there is on 5th Street. It's right outside of our office. And I never knew what it was. I walked by it a lot, and I never knew the story. And it says, remembering Sarah Marianne, is what it is. Sorry. Terry's daughter had become pregnant as a teenager and had a little girl. And she then got remarried to a good man. They're still married today, more than 50 years. They take their kids over to Idaho, and the 5-year-old girl is hit by a truck that's backing up. The family member gets very close to her. And I say this as a story about Terry, but also just so what the world of journalism would be like, what the commitment was like of him. This story was in the paper the next day. He had a way of just cutting it. The cliche is you cut a vein and just bleed it right out when you can write like this. And that's how Terry wrote. He would just sit and go. And so he writes a story, and it's the most beautiful story I've ever read in this Kitsap Sun history. It's him walking along from, he lived up on Lafayette, and he tells the story of walking on from Lafayette with this little girl and saying goodbye to her. And so, it really is good. If you want to email me and I'll send it to you. It's that good. You can't find it by searching. So then that's part of it. That's the journalist story about Terry and who he was, and that he would still have the wherewithal to tell the community, to share that pain with the community. That's what a newspaper could do. The community then, and this is the important part, because this is still what you are all part of. The community, after they read that, responds and says, what can we do? How do we help you? They don't know him, but they've read his stories and they read about this thing, and so they start giving money. And they raise all this money, and some goes to the family, and they raised enough that they planted trees outside the front of the Sun and put this plaque. And it's still there today in honor of that little girl. And Terry's son-in-law, Craig, when I wrote the story, he still walks his grandkids by. They walk by so they can see that. It would have been their aunt. And so that's what it's there. So it's another, this one didn't make, I had written that story for the 90th on like places in Kitsap County, the Adel Bridge, the totem pole down there, Cliff McNair's Trail. But this was another one that it's smaller. It's not a site anyone would ever know. It's not on any tours or history things. But that's historic, and it matters, and it's still there, and I hope it's always there. Okay, what was I going to talk about? That's the press. So that's the press. Like I said, from 1945 when they opened that building and it was downstairs, then in 1960, I believe it is, if you've ever been in our basement, you can see there's kind of a demarcation. You can tell where they expanded it and dug into the ground and pulled over. So they bought a new press, shifted the sides, and then in 1973, the thing gets refurbished again. And then one time in recent years, I think it was like 2009 or something, they kind of put money into it. But it was the same piece of machinery all of those years. And so those are old pictures, you know, what it looked like. That's a plate right there, and I have one here I'm going to show you in just a second. Those metal things in the case right there, those are called plates. There's little pieces of aluminum. And so this is how you would print a newspaper. Still do print a newspaper, the technology is still the same. I shouldn't say it's still the same. It's more digital now than it's ever been. But essentially, you come up with a plate like that, you would roll it, and so where he's hooking that onto a drum, and it then functions like a stamp pad. And so it would run like this, would pick up the ink, but the ink does not touch the paper, the ink touches this, and then this touches the paper. So it's like making a stamp, and that's how you would print a newspaper every night. They would run. At midnight is when we would do it, when I first started. That's when you'd hear the whomp of the press, and it would start going and run all those copies. And so that's what those guys, essentially that's what they're doing right there. The picture at the lower left, that was what it would have looked like, you know, at its most use. That's when the paper is being folded, and so it kind of folds down onto a conveyor, and they come out like that. The picture at the lower left is a guy named Nelson Tate, and I took that picture on, I didn't write down the date, it was like 2015. It was a day in 2015. That was the last run that ever was made in our basement press. The decision was made, and there's always a lot of reasons behind everything. You know, the industry, during my career, it's been nothing but change since I started at the Sun. And so where it was once a robust business to print all day long, there was all kinds of print jobs we would do. That was very important. There was a kind of, our business was a three-legged stool of subscriptions, advertising money, and print products. You know what I'm talking about. Tisha has coordinated a lot of these over the years. I should give her a shout out. But as others stopped printing material, that business went away for us. And so it got to a point where it didn't make financial sense. And ours was a smaller press than what a lot of other places were. It was just the one we had moved to down in Kent at the time. It must have been 4 times the size as what we were printing at the time. So there was kind of technical limitation to what it could do. And anyway, that was the last night. Here's your little backstory, and now I'm off the record with this one, but the leadership at the time didn't want us to talk about it. We were told, do not take any pictures about that. So I'm very proud of that picture because it really bothered me at the time that we couldn't do something to like honor these guys who'd worked down there and market and kind of cover it. We wanted to cover it as a news story, and the other side of the building said, no, you can't do that, don't draw attention to it. But I went down there and I hung out, read the last papers that night, and then took Nelson's picture when he was offloading those last copies that came out of our building. What that leads to is what we're doing now. And so that's kind of, we stopped using the press down there. Initially, we went over to Kent. It was called Rotary Press. It's a very big press down there. you can correct me if I get any of this wrong, but then when the Seattle Times closed their press, because it's not just us closing presses, there's very few left in Western Washington. Seattle Times had a big one in Bothell, they closed that one down, and then they said, they bigfooted us out of our press spot in Kent. They said, get out of our way, we want that one. And so we kind of had to get out of their way, that's business. And so the paper now prints at the Columbian down in Vancouver, that's the newspaper down there, and trucks up every night. So it prints fairly early. Oh, wow, you learned something. What's that? It prints fairly early, which is, we can get complicated onto this on when we have to have things done, but it prints early enough so we can get on the road, still get up here before midnight. And the carriers are all still there. They meet in Port Orchard, there's a drop site down there, and they still are on our back loading dock, middle of the night. Those, the folks that work so hard to do that, and so they're waiting for the papers, and they get them and deliver them. And I should also mention, did I say this? That's very rare. We deliver a paper, Seattle Times delivers a paper. I'm not sure if there's any others. The Columbian may deliver their paper, but in the Puget Sound region, no one else delivers a paper anymore. They do not land on doorsteps. Everything is by mail. Every other paper is delivered by mail. So small thing, but still kind of cool that we keep that up and are able to provide that service rather than the next day you get it from the post office. Sorry. But this leads me to somewhere. So I wanted to tell you about that press innovation. And there's one other thing. There's a reason I kept this particular plate. This is January 19th, 2011. This was the paper that, when we switched from designing it in our building, we would have a copy desk. And they would come into the evening crew, page designers, copy editors. For a time, this is actually really nice. This is a fun little thing. In the early 2000s, Scott Ware was the editor, and the paper was littered with mistakes. You got a copy desk, you got copy editors, you got all these people, but there were still a lot of mistakes getting through, and readers did not like it. And so he said, okay, you're so smart, you come help us. And I kid you not, there were four women, I think they were all women. And so every night, you'd get done with the paper, you'd print out proofs just on paper before it goes downstairs and starts printing, before this plate is made. And we'd have them sitting there, and around 11 o'clock, they would show up at 11, volunteers would show up at 11 o'clock at night. And they'd come in, and they'd have a seat, and they'd have their paper, their stack of papers, and their pen. And it was after all of the professionals had got done doing their job. Those people, those volunteers got a crack at it. And they'd go through them, and if they found mistakes, pass the word to the copy editor, they fix it before it went downstairs. And so literally, I mean, again, community paper, the community showed up. These volunteers would be there to help correct our mistakes. And so, but we came to a point in 2011, again, a lot of things in the industry, things were changing, there were other people experimenting with this idea. Technology allowed you to ship pages. We used to be, you had to design it upstairs and you sent it straight downstairs where they would make this plate. They could do it off-site and send something there. And so we were in a chain at the time with a group of newspapers in Texas, and they decided they would be more efficient if all of the designers sat in the same room in Texas. So this was the last issue that came out, this would have been the first one that came out doing that new thing. It took us until 3 a.m. I sat there till 3 a.m. that night before the press run. Usually the press would run at midnight, but there were so many problems, and just we were learning how to do it. We were up till 3 a.m. that night. And the point of that story is innovation, and things drive, and they force us to do things differently, and they force us to do things differently, and that's what gets done now. Our paper is designed all over the place. It all zips then to Vancouver. It doesn't really touch Bremerton. It goes down there, and we're able to do that. Technology allows us to do that. Allows people to work remote. All of those sorts of things. The two people I put up here are also they just illustrate the innovation, and that's why I wanted to, again, I told you I'm going to tell stories about people. And so, on the right is Josh Farley. I think a lot of you know Josh, but what I wanted to say about you, he works at the Seattle Times now, an editorial writer over there. Josh worked, how many years with the Sun? 17 years at the Sun, covered public safety, covered the city of Bremerton, covered military, kind of his three main groups for us. But the other thing for us was Who remembers? Who knows what I'm doing? The 5, that was a time during this era, and I think it was kind of that 2014 timeline where Josh kind of pioneered something that the community really loved, and that was a weekly news video. It was completely new for us at the time. No one had done anything like that in our newsroom. Not a lot in our industry, frankly, had done that. And Josh was dedicated to it for how many years would you say? 5 years probably, of every week telling stories in a new way. And so that was great. And it was kind of the digital era was upon the Kitsap Sun. And that was one of the things we took advantage of, doing things much differently. Angela Dice is over there on the left. And Angela was, technically there was one other web editor before Angela, but Angela was the first web editor. She was the one who, and again, it was around, it was just before this actually, I think, where she got hired in that job, 2008-ish, 2009 is when I took over that she was in, we promoted her to that role. But all of the things that we take for granted now, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, there were all these other odd social medias at the time, Square and Face things, all this. She was the one who did them all for the Sun. All of our legacy on using social media goes back to this woman because no one else was touching it. And she said, "Oh, I'll figure it all out." And she did. And for a long time, there was a point, I'll never forget this because I get competitive. And I remember sitting there looking at how many Facebook, I think it was friends back then, not likes. This is an earlier Facebook iteration. And I would count ours, and ours, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, 50,000. And we had more than the Seattle Times, we had more than King 5, all of the big ones you'd expect. And we were beating them, and it was because of Angela. She should always get the credit for bringing us into that world. And so that's my way into the kind of the digital era of the Sun owes a lot to these two people and their stories. Angela passed away 2 years ago, so that's why I'm struggling just a bit. And the funeral, or the memorial service, it was probably the largest group gathering of Sun employees that there's been, I guess, since there were 45 people in that room, which is when I started, there were 45 people in that room. And you saw what the crew is now. So she's very special in Kitsap Sun history, and it needs to be talked about in something like this. And I'm gonna end here. I need to finish. We're still at home. What was I gonna talk about here? Maybe this is just a point, just to tell you guys what's going on. Like I said, we still are in that building. In 2020, see you, Bill. In 2020, the pandemic hits in March, and we had our building on the market. The company, we're now part of the USA Today network, and that happened about 2016 is when we were absorbed. So a gigantic company. We're just one of the small fish in that. But they wanted to unload the building. That's an industry trend. Every newspaper is selling their building. You don't have real estate anymore. There was, everyone owned gigantic buildings that a lot of them are in downtowns that are degenerating. Milwaukee sold theirs for a bundle of money because where the Bucks want to build a new arena, stuff like that. So they were looking to sell it, but one of the problems was always the press, who wants to buy that big hunk of junk and environmental disaster downtown. But we found a buyer. It's a development group. It's local. So they buy us in October 2020. Conveniently enough, we're all at home anyway because of COVID. During that time, they renovate the newsroom. They say, well, how much space do you really need? We say, well, let's just have a newsroom. And so we're still in the historic spot, which I think is special. To me, it's special. I really like being there. It allows us to still work together. It allows us to have some pride in our building. And the owner put that on the cover, on the front. That was never there before. But Dale wanted to kind of honor the memory of the building by putting the Sun building on there. In fact, one of the first times I ever interacted with Lisa for the History Museum was asking, could we have your sign? Because in the alley, and I said no. In the alley, on the other side.
Shut me down immediately.
I know. It is a good sign. I don't blame you.
It's a good sign.
That's what the front looks like. If you go back and walk the alley, there's an old sign on the back door, the Bremerton Sun. And one of the other things, that had been covered up for years and years and years. It had been covered, no one could see it. And the owner, again, very graciously, he saw the value. He saw that's important, that means something. And they repainted it. It's all painted. It pops out nicely now. It looks at an alley, which is maybe not the best, but it is the sign that was right there when the building was first founded. That that is the same exact sign, it still exists. So maybe tonight after you get done, if you walk down that alley on Pacific, yeah, you'll see it there. So that's kind of neat. We're still in there, and I think, anyway, that's your little history story.
I
about
still
that.
want that sign.
We won't forget you. Okay, and then just a couple last things, and these are more, again, this is community stuff because it's important. It's not journalism, but it's what we do. That's me and Mark Ince. Mark Ince is he's the leader of Kingston ShareNet, the food bank up there. The Santa Claus Fund was founded by the Daily News Searchlight, or maybe just one of the Daily News Searchlight. I don't really know how old the Santa Claus Fund is, but it was not the Kitsap Suns. Santa Claus Fund was, so this is back in the 1920s, it's to help the Salvation Army. And when Julius Gaius founds the Sun, we say, well, we're gonna start the bell ringer, then we're gonna take that over. So it became part of the same tradition that's older than us. We still do it. We collect money each holiday season. We use Kitsap Community Foundation, is where the money flows through. And readers, I think we raised $75,000 last year. That's kind of the goal every year now. And so $75,000 then goes back out to 9 food banks. And so it's something I'm really proud of. Again, it's not journalism, but it's community. And it's thanks to folks like you that still support it, believe in it, that we can do that and make a difference. And then the other one is the Kitsap Sun Journalism Fund. This is a newer thing. This was launched in 2020. And when people, ask questions about how are you going to do this, and I was getting a lot of questions. Not questions, comments. People were saying, how can we help? They see, they see what's going on. They see that this is not as healthy as we'd like it to be, or they see we're in an industry that struggles, that is hard. And so people were saying, how do we help you? So we set up a fund. Again, it's through the Kitsap Community Foundation. It's all, there are people who've given in here, we appreciate that. And so we didn't set out, we just set out when we outlined it, so this is going to somehow help journalism. We want to make sure there's something to help journalism, whether that's something new, whether it's a way to supplement, whether it's something that could hire people. And what we settled on, after getting a good initial response, and it's raised about $75,000 over its lifetime. What we decided is the best use of the money is to fund the internship program. So the young women who I showed on that first picture, they are here, not because of anything I do, but because people have been giving money to us. And so when you make a donation, you're supporting one of those students who can come and learn in our newsroom for 10 weeks. And then they contribute stories, they help do all this work. And so we get great value out of it, and then you send kids into the world to go do stuff. One of them works at a paper, and I had this jotted down, I forgot. They've gone on to do stuff, that's the point. One guy, AJ was here 2 summers ago, and I just saw that he was hired by a TV station in San Francisco. There's another young woman, I think she just got a job in the paper in Florida. So that always warms my heart. I mean, I'd love it if they'd stay here and work for us, but sometimes they have to go back to school and then they look for jobs. But that's an important thing, and again, it's the community still being able to support us. And if it grows, who knows what we can do with it? Could you bring people in with it? Could you add coverage with it? That's kind of the dream. But it's doing what it should for right now, and it adds stories, adds journalism. And then this is my last, it's a little jokey thing. I put this in my column. If I can get philosophical for a second. Mark Vonnegut is Kurt Vonnegut's son, and there's this book that was published after his dad died, and Mark writes this intro, and he had this, and I clipped it out years ago, and I've always kept it, because it's talking about Kurt Vonnegut's work, which is different than what we do, obviously. But when he says the world is a slightly different place just because they read a damn book, and I like to think of the newspaper that way, if not more so, that every day it comes out and the world's a little different, or you might see the world a little different because it's something you read or something you learned. I think that's a really true statement. And then the other thing is that on Julius's column, that first day, he had this introduction, the introduction to the sun. That's the last sentence of it. And what precedes it is this, he does this kind of strange analogy of a baby being born, and the baby's yelling, and it's young lungs, and it's all this other stuff. But his point was, I'm not gonna brag about my kid, which I think is good. And a parent, you can all understand that as parents, everyone brags about their kid. Everyone promises how good their kid's gonna be, how smart they're gonna be. And he said, I'm not gonna do that. we're gonna show up, we're gonna do our jobs. He makes a point to say we're not gonna grind axes, which I think, I'd love to know what the context of that was in the newspaper war. There's probably something going on. But then the last sentence of it concludes with that. It says, let the things it does become the future platform of principles. And so, whenever we get criticism, I do my best to point to answer the question, but also point back to, well, we still did something today. We did that. That's today's paper. That's a big story that's important, matters. That's the building you see when you're coming to Bremerton. All your guests see that. You may swell with pride, you may not, I don't know, but the fact that it might go away, and the hammerhead crane behind it would go with it, is the context of that story. There's going to be a major project down there, and so that changes the community. You didn't know that until we told you, and so that was the thing we did today, and I think that's all we can say. So, thank you. I think that's my last slide. Appreciate you listening. That was an hour, and I hope it didn't feel like an hour. And we also appreciate your reading.
You're all welcome to hang out. There's more snacks and food and beverage back there, so please feel free. Also, you can, the museum's still open, and help yourself. So again, thank you, David. Appreciate it. That was awesome. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna go this way. Yeah, well, I haven't been back. I'm still in. Eventually.